Hello, I'm Curt Tofteland. I'm the founder of Shakespeare Behind Bars, also a co-founder of the Shakespeare in Prison Network. I'm here today with Stephan Wolfert of DE-CRUIT and Bessel van der Kolk. If you have not read Bessel's book, The Body Keeps the Score, I highly recommend it. Over the 25 years I've worked with incarcerated, I've read lots of trauma books, lots of articles. It's the best one, the most succinct, inclusive. Bessel has a wonderful writing style. It's easy to read. It's got science in it, but it doesn't pull us artistic types down. And it's been on the New York Times bestseller list for 110 weeks, which is quite remarkable for a book of this sort. It's a terrific book. I know for all my colleagues out there that you would find great benefit in reading it. And we're here today to have a conversation with Bessel and Stephan and I. Mostly it's about Bessel. So without further ado, Bessel van der Kolk.
Thank you, Curt. And thank you, Stephan, for being here also. Yeah, I'm a psychiatrist, and I've spent the last 40 years or so studying trauma, what happens in the brain, what happens in the body, what happens between people. And I'm particularly delighted to be part of this series because I love theater. And I think that theater is one of the oldest and most effective ways of dealing with trauma. And of course, that's very different from what your insurance company pays you for. But what I see happening over and over again, for example, in a program like Shakespeare in Prison, is that theater oftentimes can do much more radical alterations in people. And a very good example of that also is my dear friend, Stephan Wolfert, who himself went through the journey of theater and his own self-exploration and self-discovery and coming to peace with himself through theater. And I just love Stephan's work, and I think it's exemplary to all of us. And to really think about outside of the box and to think about how we can get people to come back from trauma, which can be very, very difficult. And also, if you don't come back from trauma, it ruins your life. You know, when you get stuck in your trauma, nothing comes in. You're always grumpy. You're always angry. You're always dissatisfied. You always don't feel like you stand in the grace of God or whatever you call it. And you really need to heal your trauma in order to allow life to come in and to interact with life. And so and theater is one of those beautiful things that can wake people up to start coming alive. It doesn't mean that it's the only thing you can do. There's many other things you can do and many other things that most people need, but theater certainly is one of them. So let me show you some stuff. A few years ago, I took the advanced Shakespeare acting training course for two main reasons. One is to get rid of my accent, and second is to get a better projected voice. As you can hear, it was a big failure, but I learned a lot about theater. And so as we took the Shakespeare course, one of our colleagues, Louisa Franconi, who conceived a baby at that time, and 8 months after we finished our training, she sent a little picture along of her and her kid. And I thought it's just beautiful. As far as I know, anybody but the most heartless people looking at this little clip cannot help but smile and feel warm all over. And why is that? Why do we feel warm all over? I think it's because this movie shows our primal state. Our primal state is for us to be engaged with people and to move together and to make noises. You know, some other pictures of monkeys playing together. Basically, human beings are monkeys with big forebrain, and we're meant to play, we're meant to move, we're meant to be rhythmically in tune with each other. And what you can see in this kid also is how there is no hesitation. There is no fear, am I doing it right? Mom is there for me. And mom is not afraid either. She just loves this little kid. So they're moving together. And, you know, in all the years that I've studied trauma, one of the things that sort of increasingly have come to stand out is that trauma is about the loss of synchrony, the loss of attunement. When we're expressive people, when you start doing something that hurts me, I will go, hey, stop that. Or I'll have a look at my face to communicate like, I really don't like what's going on here. If you pay attention to me and you change, then I feel in tune and I feel safe. If you don't respond to my signals of danger and keep yelling or keep screaming or beating me up, then I no longer feel safe and I start feeling all uptight and I become defensive and angry and go into fight flight. And so the natural state of human beings is to just openly see each other, to just meet each other. And trauma is all about getting frozen and uptight. Not only that, but this forms our brain. A very core and complex issue is that in the middle of our brain, we sort of have a map of the world. Our brain is a predictive organ. Our brain tells us, oh, if I do this, there will be coffee in there and I'll be able to libate myself. And if I start yelling right now, Curt at some point will go, hey, take it easy, and he'll give me some signals. And so our brain sort of keep predicting what's happening and has a little roadmap. When you get traumatized, particularly traumatized early in life, your roadmap of your brain is one of people don't like me, I'm in danger, the world is a really scary and awful place, and I'm a piece of shit. And you can sort of try to behave as if you don't feel that way. You can become very successful in whatever profession you do, but deep inside that map of I'm no good and I'm a piece of shit and not worthy of anybody's love will continue to be the core perception of yourself. And so then the big question becomes, how do you repair these frozen maps of danger, fear, and self-loathing? These maps are hardwired and really become part of the brain. That's what we see in our brain scans, is how these pathways in the brain get changed by abuse, neglect, and trauma. And the moment that we feel in sync with other people, we get a deep sense of joy. In fact, it's hard to imagine joy without synchrony. Synchrony is about being with a friend who moves together with you, to be with somebody and their voice changes and you start singing together along the same lines. That's the core natural piece. And so we're meant to move and we're meant to react and we're meant to have a body that is engaged with our environment and to be open and to move with other people. So here's my first brain-like slide. So this is a slide from Joe Ledoux. It's also in the book. And so what Joe Ledoux, the great neuroscientist, shows is that if threat comes into the brain, here's your brain, and in the middle of your brain is this area called the lateral nucleus of the amygdala, it's your smoke detector. And so you see the scary creature, the filtering, the smoke detector picks that up. And what Ledoux shows is that in response to this threat, you can activate your body. You can move something. You get a deep sense of competency and able to do something. So in order to overcome your fears, you need to take action. And hey, you may be a tough guy, you may hurt me, but I have a 50-degree black belt in karate, and I can protect myself. And as long as you can do something, the fear actually can stir people up to be effective. What Ledoux shows is that if you're helpless, if you cannot move, if you cannot take action when somebody screams at you yells you, attacks you, and you're frozen, then in the brain, it goes a different pathway, and the impulse goes to the central nucleus of the amygdala, and once it goes there, it creates a feeling of helplessness, collapse, depression, and despondency. And so the issue very central to the issue of trauma is, can I do something when this terrible thing happens to me, or am I paralyzed? The people who really understand that is the US military, who actually learned it from Prince Maurits of Nassau, a Dutch guy back in the 16th century in the Independence War, who in turn learned it from the Roman old army manuals. And what did the old Romans learn is that if you have a bunch of guys together sitting doing nothing, they become very dangerous and they start fighting. So what the old Romans started to do, they started to drill men, and they started to march, and they started to sing. And that was revived by Prince Maurits and eventually made its way to the US military in the form of basic training. And I spent some time actually setting up yoga programs at Camp Lejeune, so I got to know the Marine Corps somewhat well here. And it's an amazing outfit. I got to have an enormous respect for them, because the kids who join the military, you may not notice, don't go in there as the most competent, heroic, wonderful, gifted people in the world. In fact, we know that the average abuse score and family violence and alcoholism score of people who join the military is much higher than the general population. The military in America has always served that if you have nothing else to do and the prospects aren't very good, you join the military. And oftentimes the military can play a fantastic role in helping you to get a sense of agency, productivity, fitting in, having a sense of mission, having friends. It can be a very beautiful experience. So how does the Army manage to get these guys who are sort of all over the place, who are probably not very good in whatever they're doing, and get them to be soldiers? And how do you do it? Like this.
If I die in a combat zone, lock me up and get me home. Box me up and ship me home. Pin my medals upon my chest. Pin my medals upon my chest. Tell my mom I don't.
So what does the Army do? They get people to move, to do things that are at the very edge of their capacities. And they go to bed and they say, oh my God, I can't do another day like this. And you do another day. And you do it together with other people. And you move together and you move in sync. And 12 years later, you see a profound transformation. And that these guys who were not really very capable of people come out and they're very good at what they do. And this is, of course, is the basis of Stephan Wolfert's program, DE-CRUIT. He says, in the same way that you need to recruit people into the army and you need to train them to become military people, we need to also decruit people so you can help them to move their bodies in a way that they can be safe in contemporary society. When you move together and you sing together and you recite poetry together, you get this sense of pleasure, the sense of cohesion, the sense of mission. And why is this important? I'm going to digress for a second to talk about the brain. Not that the brain is everything, and I think in some ways we pay too much attention to just the brain and not to many other things. But in the last 30 years, we have learned a lot about the brain, and we have learned some very important lessons about how the brain is affected by trauma. And that for me is a real sort of a major justification why you do things like yoga, singing, dancing, and theater in traumatized populations, because you need to move something and create some brain circuits that got damaged by the trauma. So let's just start here. Here's our brain. 30 years ago, nobody knew sort of what this little area was or what this was. And this is all relatively new stuff. And so here's our brain, and here's our little front of our brain, our prefrontal cortex. That is you, that is me. And when we talk and we argue and we get along together and we talk about stuff like what I'm doing with you right now, that's basically a frontal lobe production It's a marvelous part of the brain. It can talk, it can figure things out, it can symbolize, it can be creative. It's wonderful. Unfortunately, that is not where trauma sits. Where trauma sits is deep down in the parts of your brain that are in charge of your survival. So this part of your brain we have in common with all other mammals. Basically, it's all looks pretty much the same way. It's a very large part of our brain, and it takes care of the housekeeping of the body and how we react to our environment. That's where we have this map of the world, just like our dogs do and horses and animals. So trauma hits over here. Trauma hits in this deep survival part of the brain that is a different part of the brain than the front part of the brain. So the talking, understanding, figuring out part of the brain is different from the part of your brain that tells you time to go to the bathroom, time to eat, time to sleep, time to change your position. That's your animal brain, that's your survival brain. And trauma really hits your survival brain. Just a little bit more about this. And so roughly you can split the brain into 3 layers, 3 parts, rough way of speaking. And so when you're a little baby, you come into the world with a brainstem, with this part over here. And that's in charge of doing the things that little babies can do. And what can babies do? They can be awake, they can be asleep, they can eat, they can suck, they can poo, they can pee, and they breathe. And that's about it. It's a very primitive part. And most of us don't pay much attention to these core functions. But we should, because these are the core functions get that disturbed by trauma. I don't think I've ever met a traumatized person who has a completely normal appetite. I don't think I've ever met traumatized people with normal sleep dream patterns, arousal levels, breathing issues. And so there's very core issues of how the body regulates itself. And when you go to psychology school or social work school or psychiatry school, you learn nothing about how to deal with that primitive system of the brain. And I didn't know anything about it until I took my first yoga class. And I go like, my yoga teacher, make a long story short, but he clearly was crazy. He was mentally not well. And he's doing yoga, and he thought, that's interesting. He's a guy who has a thought disorder, who is teaching me yoga, and he's doing a good job. And I thought to myself, maybe the reason that this guy is not in an institute for the mentally insane is because he's doing yoga. Because maybe even though there's some stuff here that isn't quite working, the back of his brain is being stabilized by yoga. So I got very interested in yoga. And we did the first research, scientific research, that showed that yoga actually is a very good treatment for PTSD. And so that's where that stuff sits. And then the next piece of the brain is this middle area over here that again is not conscious, it's just the map of the world. And there's some snow beginning to fall out here, and I go like, oh my God, snow. And suddenly I get all excited about seeing snow because I have very warm association with snow. Somebody else sees snow and they're like, oh my God, get me out of here. I've got to go to Florida because snow is the worst thing that can happen to you. And so your brain automatically determines what you like and what you don't like. And these automatic reactions are very hard to change. And that's very much where trauma sits. Trauma sits in anybody who looks like this is scary. Anybody who dresses like this is scary. Anybody who makes it sound is scary. And that's the automatic reaction that you have. And your nice little frontal lobe can say, don't be silly. There's nothing wrong with this person. But your limbic system is oftentimes more powerful than your frontal lobe. And even though you know you shouldn't be scared, you're scared to death. And even though you know that you shouldn't get enraged about some minor issue, you blow up because that survival part of your brain works with it. So the challenge for us to overcome trauma is that how do we calm down our brain stems and how do we change our perceptions of the world. And that's where theater comes in. And what I see these days is that a lot of therapy is about telling people to change their thinking. I have tried that. I tried it with my 3-month-old baby who was colicky. And I said to this 3-month-old baby, don't you understand, if you wake us up all night, we're going to be cranky and we're going to resent you and my job isn't going to go well. So could you please be quiet so they be considerate of your parents? It didn't work. I also have been consistently trying to tell my wife about explain to her how dysfunctional her behavior is. And whenever I do that, she goes, thank you so much for explaining what a nitwit I am, and with your superior wisdom to explain to me how my thinking is all distorted and I should adopt your thinking. It always works, right? And I can't really believe how low psychology has sunk that you think that telling people you should think differently will actually make people think differently. No, it isn't that simple, okay? So basically, this is a picture that really, for me, grabs what goes on. It's the last page of my anatomy textbook for medical school. And many years later, I think about that picture again and say, yeah, he got it. And when you are in a terrible situation, the frontal lobe of your brain shuts down. So you become a blubbering idiot. All of us have been blubbering idiots. When we get really upset, we get frightened, we don't talk very rationally, we don't think very rationally, that part of our brain goes away. Our limbic system takes over. Our limbic system is in charge of survival. So something in you says, I'm going to die if my child continues to make some noise on the floor. So I got to yell at this child. It doesn't make any sense, but your limbic system thinks that the noise of that child is going to kill you. So your limbic system takes over, and then when as it activates your body, and you start stress hormones, body movement, etc., and then when the stress is over, you calm yourself down. So the whole issue of dealing with trauma is that we need to quiet down this limbic system, that survival brain, and we need to activate the prefrontal cortex, the rational part of the brain, so we can notice who we are and what's going on with ourselves. And of course, theater does both of those things very well. I'll just show you one piece of research that I did that was very formative for me. So I happen to be part of the first team of researchers that did brain scans of people who were reliving their trauma. So this is a composite picture of 8 people who are in the scanner having a flashback. A terrible experience, by the way. Nobody would give us permission to do this study today because it's too horrendous to lie in a brain scanner and to feel like you're being raped again. But that was what happened at this time. So what you see here is a cross-section of the brain like this. Here's the front of the brain, back of the brain, right of the brain, left of the brain. And so when people are in their trauma, what lights up is this area over here, which we call it the temporoparietal junction, but you could also call it oh shit area. Like you go like, oh my God. And that's all you feel, like intense emotions. And that's about it. Huh? And it sits on the right side of the brain. Nothing happens to the left side of the brain. That's important because the right side of the brain is the non-logical feeling, experience, spatial part of your brain. The spatial thing becomes very important because the spatial thing gets played with when you do theater. The spatial thing doesn't get played with when you do sitting in your chair talking. So your right brain is a spatial brain. It has no sense of time. It only has a sense of emotion. The left side of your brain, some people in Southern California think the left side of the brain is a terrible part of your brain. That's a great part of your brain. I wouldn't leave home without either of the parts of my brain. The left side of the brain helps you to figure things out, to be logical, to talk to other people, to be able to set up a program, to be able to make sequences, to know about time. It's a very useful part of your brain. That part of your brain gets pushed away when you're in your trauma, and your right side of the brain takes over. But what's particularly important is this little thing over here. This little area over here. It's the area over here in your prefrontal cortex. That's the speech center of your brain. And that's a part of you, that part of me right now that allows me to tell you how the brain works and how I think theater might be helpful. And what we found in our study is when people are in the middle of their trauma, the speech center disappears, goes offline. And I go, yeah, I know that. When I get really upset, I become like a blubbering idiot. I'm usually sound like I've kissed a blarney stone, and when I get really upset, I lose all capacity to be rational. And then I think about Shakespeare. Because if somebody in Shakespeare becomes upset, he says, and they got struck with speechless terror, or they became dumbfounded. So that guy over 400 years ago had figured already, when people in their trauma, they don't have language. Now, none of us is as smart as Shakespeare, but at least if he could figure out that people cannot talk when they're in the middle of their trauma, we should pretty much catch up that we can't do that either. And so he said, tell me about your rape. Oh, tell me about how your dad used to beat you up. And you're supposed to just sit there and tell your story. No, it doesn't work that way, because the left brain shuts down and all you feel is that right brain that goes like, I'm a worthless piece of shit, or my dad is horrible, I'm going to take revenge on people. All that emotional stuff is there, but that understanding, mature part of your brain disappears. And so this is the sort of stuff that made me interested in doing trauma work, because this trauma is very primitive. It sits in a very primitive part of your brain. I'm not even going to explain all this. This is very depressing. All the things that go wrong in your brain is unbelievable. And then one more thing about the brain, and then I'll go into theater. And that is, so if all this automatic reaction that you have, that you become upset, or you get freaked out, or you shut down, or cannot relate, if it all sits in the back of your brain, roughly speaking, your amygdala, how do you get there? So this is your conscious part of your brain, yourself. This is your automatic survival brain. And what Ledoux shows is that the understanding, figuring out, analyzing part of your brain cannot get there. So you cannot understand your way out of your trauma. Now you can go like, oh, now I know why I get so upset, or no, I know why I have trouble getting along with papa. But just knowing why you're screwed up doesn't make you less screwed up. But now, as if my first friend who went through psychoanalysis, very blunt lawyer, he said, before I went into psychoanalysis, I was a real asshole. And then I went through psychoanalysis, and now I am a well-analyzed asshole. And sadly, I sort of had to agree with him. And so understanding why you're messed up doesn't do it. You have to actually repair the damage. And to my mind, psychology is not all that good at that at this point. And so your understanding and figuring out part of your brain doesn't get you. But it turns out there is a part of the brain that can get there. And that's your medial prefrontal cortex, which I call the mohawk of your brain. In neuroscience, you call it the midline structures of the cortex, the interoceptive part of your brain. This is how it goes. Most of our brain is made to do what I'm doing right now, is to be focused on you, to talk, to pay attention to you outside. And that is what makes people the social creatures that we are. And that gets located in both of our parts, side parts of our brain is a social brain, and a very large part of our brain is social. It's about my relationship to you and how I fit in and how you fit in with me and whether we like each other, all that sort of good stuff. So in the middle of your brain is this area over here that's devoted to you, to your feelings, to yourself. So if I would ask you right now, so just notice how your butt is sitting on your chair. And notice if you have more pressure on your left butt cheek or your right butt cheek. And just for a moment, pay attention to how your feet touch the ground, and pay attention to your right foot and your left foot, and wiggle your right toe and see how your right toe is different from your left toe. And you can do this whole body scan, and then you activate that interoceptive part of your brain, that noticing yourself part of the brain. As it turns out, the only part of you that can get control of yourself is that part of you that can look deep inside of yourself and allow yourself to feel what you feel. So Curt asked me, what did you learn when you took the advanced Shakespeare program? I thought as much as anything, we learned to pay attention to our internal world, to really notice what is the sensations in our bodies and what our movements felt like, what it felt like inside of ourselves. And it turns out that's the only way we can become masters of our own ship. And when you see Cry Havoc, for example, you see Stephan going very deep inside of himself, and you join him when he goes deep into himself. And not only does he deal with and transform his internal experience, but as we look at him, he is such a good actor that he is actually able to activate our mirror neuron system, so that as you see him going through his process of coming to terms with himself, vicariously, I go through the process of dealing with these very deep issues also. And so that's what theater is all about. It's about activating the mirror neuron system in your audience so they can feel what you are feeling. And how do they feel what you're feeling? By the tone of your voice and by your body movements. That is the fundamental way in which we identify with, and to some degree become like each other. And that's the power of theater, is to not only use words, but to use tone of voice and body movement, which is all right part of the brain. And so, but we need to go deep inside. And then, of course, the issue is that trauma has a devastating effect on the brain, including on that going inside sort of thing. And so now we get into theater, and so I hang out people here at Shakes & Co. And they have a program called Shakespeare in the Courts. And I live in I think to my mind, one of the most civilized place in the world, in Berkshire County, Massachusetts. It's a marvelous place. It's really a lot of good programs here. One of the programs is Shakespeare in the Courts. And if you're a young juvenile delinquent in our area, you have a 50% chance of the judge giving you a choice between going to jail or joining a Shakespeare acting program. That's civilization. And some of the kids choose jail because becoming a Shakespearean actor is really, really scary. But I think, isn't it great, because these kids are able to being taught to inhabit certain roles, and these kids are sneaky and scared and upset, and now they have to be a king, and they have to be Lady Macbeth, and she has to say, if he had not so resembled my father, I would have done the deed myself. And to really become this powerful queen who is able to blackmail her husband into killing his king makes you feel like, oh, that's what a powerful queen looks like. So the first time I go see the graduation program of Shakespeare in the Courts, I'm really excited about these juvenile delinquents having turned into Shakespearean actors. It's the worst goddamn theater program I've ever seen in my life. These kids have never stood up straight in front of somebody and said, "Hi, my name is Robert." And now they need to say, "Hi, my name is Julius Caesar." And they have never done that before. They're not very good at it. They need to learn to stand up there and to feel their bodies and to feel their presence. And that's what the theater director can do. They can help them to become somebody who they were not before. They can instill an embodied new presence. The reason that I got so interested in that is that we teach all these courses, and oftentimes I ask people in the course, so if you, I don't do this anymore. My wife hates it when I do that, so I don't do it anymore. But I used to say, so if you went on a dating site and you wanted to meet your soul mate, what would you put in your dating site about yourself? And about a third of the people in our classes would say, I would say that I'm an incest victim, or I would say that I'm a disabled Vietnam vet. You go, that's an interesting way of advertising for your soulmate. I'm not sure if that's really the best way of doing it. And what really became very clear to me is that their identity was so locked up with their trauma that they could not be there to open up themselves up for new relationships and new possibilities. And I thought maybe the theater can help people do that. And so one last story about Shakespeare in the Court that illustrates this is that there's a girl in the program who, an incest survivor and juvenile delinquent, stole cars and stuff, and she's now in the program. And Kevin Coleman, the director, says to her, now in the next scene, you're Ophelia, and you're going to drown yourself and kill yourself, and then Hamlet's going to come and pick you up and carry you off stage. And the girl says, "No way, I'm an incest survivor and no guy is going to touch me." And Kevin says, "Actually, you're Ophelia and you're dead." And the girl says, "Oh, if I'm Ophelia, I'm dead, then it's okay to be carried off." So as long as you're stuck in this one role that you play, all kinds of things do not become possible. But by playing, things become possible again, by playing different roles. I have the very good fortune these days to at least see my grandchildren on Zoom, and they're playing all the time. And they're trying out different roles all the time. That's the natural thing to do. But once you get traumatized, you play less and less and less because you become so uptight, because you get so afraid of what people will do to you, and you get so afraid of yourself and your own reactions. And so a very important part of what we need to do is to help people to open themselves up, to learn to play, to experience themselves in new ways. And then we all start hanging out with Dalai Lama, some other brain stuff. But let's go to the program. So 20 years ago now, I met this guy, Paul Griffin, who ran a program at the time in Washington, D.C. called City at Peace. And I thought, this is great. He's a theater director. I know basically nothing about theater. And he works with traumatized kids. I know a lot about trauma. So let's hook up together, and I learn from him and he learns from me. Turns out he learned nothing from me, I think, because he just got it. And the premise is we all have had lives. We've had very complex lives, and we're going to take stories of our lives and to write about it and make scenes with it and write songs about it and really donate the story of our lives to the common good. Then halfway through, we're going to stop the storytelling, and now we're going to become the best playwrights, costume designers, musicians, whatever we do, and put it out there, and we're going to put our life stories and transform it into a performance by becoming very good. This is very different from what mental health professionals do. Mental health professionals say, you're screwed up and I'm not, and I'm going to fix you so that over time you'll become just as normal as I am. It's a very strange premise, but that is the premise of mental health professionals. And the premise here is much more real. Like, man, none of us, every life is difficult. Maybe my life is a lot more easy than yours is, but I've had my series of issues also, and we all do. And we all are challenged by doing something and making something out of a very complex life. And all of our stories are worth telling. Competency is one of our greatest protectors against helplessness and trauma. It's a big issue wherever you go, and that is that, if you're a middle-class parent, you take your kids from their piano lessons to their hockey lessons to their samba dances, whatever lessons. Why do you do that? Do you take your kids to all these things because you love sitting with a teenager in a traffic jam at rush hour traffic? No, you do this because all parents know on some level that life sucks a good amount of the time. But if you happen to be a very good piano player, or you happen to be good in ice hockey, or you happen to be good in basketball or in singing, and you have your choir, and you have your band, and you have your team, then even if your heart breaks, when you do these things, you feel so much better about yourself. And so the issue of pleasure and competence is such an important protector against becoming traumatized. And this is something that our school systems these days are completely missing. My parents, in their wisdom, put me into a wonderful school where we took care of animals, and there was a lot of theater, a lot of music, a lot of movements, and nobody ever had to tell me to do my schoolwork, because when you are a safe and enthusiastic kid, you want to learn. Isn't it? Of course I'm going to try to do that math, even though it doesn't come naturally, because I love my exploration of myself. But if you're a kid who completely against all cultural values is supposed to sit down for a whole day in his desk and not move, and that's your learning, those kids are going to hate learning. Like, duh, And so the issue of pleasure and singing and moving should be the very foundation of all worthwhile institutions. That's, and when you go to a place like where I may be teaching, not right now, but Zoom, of course, in Capello or Esselen or any of these places, we spend our time singing, moving, and dancing in order to sort of get that sense of pleasure in our bodies. Because if you're miserable and I say, tell me about your trauma, you go like, no, I don't want to go talk about trauma. I feel miserable enough as it is. I'm not going to feel even more miserable. But if you feel okay about yourself and you feel a sense of pleasure in your body, and you say, let's talk about how hard it was for you to have an alcoholic dad, you go like, yeah, that was really hard. So from a position of safety, you can go and talk about miserable stuff. But once you're frozen, you're not going to open yourself up. And so the opening is, how do you create a sense of pleasure, synchrony, and enjoyment with each other? People oftentimes think, oh, you work with easier populations, or, the kids I work with are so much more difficult. I bet that when Curt teaches in prison, this is what you also deal with. People, I'm going to, and so you need to seduce people into doing it. And this is how it is. I'm sure that's how it is for Curt a good amount of time. And, at some point we got a grant actually from the CDC to study theater. And the best part, one of the best jobs I've ever had, was hiring the theater group. How did I hire the theater group? I asked people sent me their little CVs, and I sat down with them, talked with them. And if after 5 minutes I have the feeling like, boy, when I grow up, I want to become just like you, I said, you're hired. That's the only criteria. Did I want to be like you? Did you have the energy that makes me think, I want to be more like you? And when you're a frightened, terrified, upset kid, you need to meet people who you want to be like. And that puts a tremendous burden on all of us, to be people who people want to be like. And if they're not going to be like you, their examples are going to be drug dealers and prison guards and toughest people who blow people up. So it's a real competition. It's a competition of mirror neurons. Do I rather grow up like Curt Tofteland, or do I rather grow up like Donald Trump? For me, I think I'll take Curt because he knows Shakespeare. It's important for me to know if people know Shakespeare. So who do I become like? And in order to, and once you say he's a cool person or she's cool, you want to do things and make changes for that person. And there's very much, I see that the Shakespeare program very much here, the Shakespeare program that we did, that Stephan also did, it's also very personal. You see certain people say like, wow, that Kevin, he's so cool. I want to become more like Kevin. I want to become more like Tina. So we all need to have these teachers who we want to be like. And so many of the people we work with have parents and teachers where you go like, get me out of here. It's a very big thing where you work on Indian reservations, for example. It's a culture that's very much based on honoring your elders. But if your elders are drunks and your elders are violent and your elders molest children, the culture falls apart because you don't have somebody to follow anymore. And then how do you find other people there who you can actually look up to and be like? And because that's such an important part of life. And the theater group certainly brings that to life, that there's people who you can model yourself after and who can model themselves for you. You can do things together and you can speak together in a way that you can really identify with people who you may not have had an opportunity to identify with before. And what do you do with that? In mental health, people try to fix things all the time, so you won't feel that way. One of the things love about Shakespeare is that there are very few happy endings. Othello kills Desdemona. The stories about Shakespeare are very much like the stories about many traumatized people's lives. And they just live out what fate was dealing with them. But I think if you can play act Richard, if you can Richard III, or play act Richard II, or play out act Richard III, you can say, oh, that was his destiny because he lived in this body. But I don't have to live in this body. I don't have to be a uptight, frightened hunchback who needs to punish people all the time. But that is what it feels like. And so this is something I can feel, but I can also feel something else. And so what theater makes it possible for you is to actually, this kid probably at this point, all he knows is how to be angry and frightened and to be prepared for the next horrible thing. If he does theater, he gets to feel it, but with a different outcome. And he has choices about what role he's going to play. And maybe play somebody who is like Brutus and who calmly contemplates himself, or who is like the Merchant of Venice and who plots revenge because he has been hurt. I say, oh, that's what it feels like. Oh, that's what happens in your body. And so you really get to know yourself, and you get to know a whole range of possibilities, but you don't change it. You repair it by having experiences that are different from the karma road that you were living. So writing about your own experience is a very, do you do that in DE-CRUIT, Stephan?
Yes, very much.
So really finding words from your own experience is terribly important. And because you do it, I'd like to say something about it. So there's a guy by the name of Jamie Pennebaker at the University of Texas who studied writing extensively and done wonderful scientific research on the power of writing and how it changes your immune system, it changes your whole relationship to yourself, it changes your relationship to other people. Very beautiful piece of work. And so when I did my yoga study, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to compare yoga where you don't talk at all, just work with your body, with writing, where you don't use your body at all, and to compare the two. And then I looked at what the research was, and it turned out that that writing hadn't been all that helpful for PTSD. So I called Jamie. I said, Jamie, it's all these studies that people have done for PTSD, and it doesn't seem to work so well. What do you make of that? He says, those damn therapists, they don't read what I'm doing. I tell people, you should write for yourself. You should find work for yourself. But therapists always want to get in on the action. They're a bunch of warriors who say, tell me about it, or tell your group about it. But the issue really is a private issue of you needing to find words for yourself. And the moment that you start talking to somebody else, as I'm doing right now, my talking becomes distorted by my desire for you to like me, and your desire for my desire for you to think, Bart, this guy really knows what he's talking about, even though he's not an actor. So I distort what I say to become acceptable. So the moment you open your mouth to tell somebody else something, your primary motivation is not, do I find my own truth? The primary motivation is, will this person like me, or will this person give me money, or whatever our motivation is. So talking to other people is always impure. And what the Pennebaker says, it's about writing to yourself and allowing yourself to find the words for your own internal experience. Very, very important piece. This is really about gradually and slowly and safely letting out your internal experience. But here they are reenacting a rape, and they're triggering a traumatic response, which is very, very bad and very dangerous. It's very important to not traumatize people. So the trick is, for theater directors and for therapists both, is to push people to the edge of their comfort, but not push them over it. And for all of us therapists, theater directors, to see how far we can go so that we don't push people into a reliving of their trauma. And so here it's too open a scene, and the girl over here has a flashback, and it's quite horrifying to see that. You need to go to deep emotional places, but not push people over the edge. I saw this regularly at Shakes & Co., that people got quite triggered. You know, a lot of actors, of course, have their own trauma issues. And what really impressed me is Dennis Karsnick, who, when people started to go into that, said, say your lines, speak your lines. You're Julius Caesar, speak your lines. You're Brutus, speak your lines. And so the lines of Shakespeare can really anchor you, even though your body wants to push you back into being that abused kid again. Anchoring yourself in your role, in your uniform, allows you to get some distance. I'm curious what you guys will say about it. So that is trauma therapy. I think that's about as good a program as I can think of. So, what do you think?
Well, I've got 10,000 comments and 15,000 questions. So it's all good. It's all good. I mean, that's what I found in your book. Here's something, because the rape part, the reliving of the rape is very, very difficult. Of course, working in prison, we have these kinds of experiences. Much more difficult to pull out of the men, in my experience, than it is to pull out of the women, because there's so much shame attached with being a man who has been raped.
But
and the percentage of rapes that happen with males is astronomical in prison. It's just not talked about. So one of the things that I always hold in the front of my mind is, I am an artist who does work that is therapeutic. I'm not a therapist who does work that is artistic, and I never forget the difference. There's so much that I learned in your book that I learned in reading your book that I just was doing instinctually.
Right.
There are instinctual things that come that you don't have science attached to it, but you figure out how
the
it
science
works.
always comes later. That justify what you do. That's
well. I think so much of it is like Shakespeare. You know, Shakespeare wasn't sitting there going ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. Right. He was just an artist who was using this form, but he was using it freely, and then all of the stuff comes behind it, which sadly often kills it. So I when I'm working with men in prison, women in prison, I've got juveniles now. I'm never talking about any of the crap that was shoved down my throat when I was taking Shakespeare classes, because it's about what does it mean, and they quickly pick up on the rhythm of it and all of those English attachments, terms, alliteration. Oh, that's alliteration. It's like, you know. So one of the other things.
So you want that right brain piece.
Yes.
You want the experience of feeling the words in your body, and that's one of the things I certainly learned in Shakes and Co. As to say, you have this talking in your ear, and you say, if he had not so resembled my father, and your director says, does your father know that you're doing this program? Did your father love you? Did your father, and as you say, my father, suddenly the father becomes gigantic in your feeling life. And that's the power of theater, is that you have the capacity to really allow people to feel things very deeply on a visceral level without going into your head and explaining it to them. We leave that to the English professors. Yeah.
The other thing that I took away from your book, which and I've heard you talk in speeches and talks that you've given, is that where do you get the roadmap to work with someone? And it's always, you say, from the patient. Right. I get it from the patient. How do you devise this therapy for this person? Well, I get it from the patient, right? So we as theater directors and as actors are very, very much the same. Is we can have 5 guys playing Hamlet, the same scene. I do often have the entire company memorize the exact same speech. And then we get up and we start working on it and unpacking it. And of course, what each person brings to it makes it so unique and so different and not wrong. And I particularly use that with the juveniles, right? Because they think it's just one way to do a speech. And it's to teach them that, no, that's what art is. That's why every Hamlet that's ever been played is a unique Hamlet and as viable as any other Hamlet.
And to know you can play it this way or you can play it that way. Yeah. And when you're traumatized, you can only play it one way.
Right. And see, again, coming from your book, the science, and I know Stephan and I have talked about this too, because he has NYU is providing research and stuff, because so many grant writers need to have the science attached to what we know as artists works, right?
But the best researchers will always get more money than you will.
Absolutely. No question. But the good news is the little tiny amount of money that I do get, I think I have perhaps a lot more fun with it, and maybe it's more valuable than someone that gets a gigantic research grant. But I'm not poo-pooing research. I mean, you pull so much of your background. I just want to ask one question, and that is, I heard a bit of your background, that you were around the arts with your parents and education, which is wonderful, right? But when you came out of graduate school, you started working with Vietnam vets, and that began the work.
It took a while. It took about 10 years.
Okay.
Between getting my medical degree and the veterans, actually took Yeah, it took 8 years. Yeah, yeah.
And I was working. I've been working in prison, right? So, and I am Vietnam War era. My draft number was 29.
Mine was
Thankfully
7.
they stopped draft. Yours was what?
7.
7. Yeah. But my deferment was up in 3 months, and thankfully they stopped drafting, so I didn't have to go. And I would have had to made a very tough decision. Do I go? I was against the war. I protested against the war. All of that. But I encountered, when I first went to prison, Vietnam War vets locked up.
A lot of them. Yeah.
Which then began my journey. And Stephan, of course, is a soldier and deals with this much more than I do, concentrated. But now I have Afghanistan vets, and so trauma was there, and I instinctually failed many times, of course, but that's how I learned to deal with trauma, was on the front line without being trained in it, but being cautious.
The thing about working with young people is they do a lot of things wrong, but their enthusiasm makes up for that. And you got to work with an old experienced person, and that has its advantages. But you're an old guy, so it's special as you used to be as a 30-year-old.
Yeah. Well, but the good news is I'm still a child, even though I'm an old guy that has a lot of experience. I'm still enthusiastic about it, which is what gets it through. Anyway, Stephan, any comments or questions? This is going to be such a great Q&A, because I know that as invigorated as I get about watching this and seeing it and hearing it and figuring out what do I do or what don't I do and all of stuff, it's just going to create so many questions. And that was the whole point of it, is for this exposure, that here is such a resource. Your work is such a resource, and seize it and let's spread the news. So Stephan.
Nice handoff, Curt. And go. I actually, because we have the Bessel Kolk here, I want to refer to, because I had mentioned him and I didn't know that you were friends, and of course you are, Bessel, because you know everyone in this field, which is amazing. But and I'm not sure I'm saying his name correctly, but Strozier, Strozier, is that correct?
Strozier. Oh yeah, I know Chuck.
Yeah. So he wrote. I want to go back to the rhythm part of this, which is the anchor for what we do. Excuse me, I think for all of this is that Strozier was working, and a trigger warning for anyone watching this, I'm about to talk about 9/11, not in detail, but just referring to it. But Strozier worked with survivors of 9/11 and found that there's a paper that's the trauma and poetry, or the verse of, I forget the exact name, I'll get it for you so you have it, Curt and Scott. But we refer to it a lot because he found that when he was listening, he taped his patients, the people he was working with, so he had a transcript, not for public release, but his transcriber wrote it out in prose. When he listened to it again, or read it rather, he found, if I remember his study correctly, he found that he couldn't understand what the hell was going on. He got lost in the prose of it. But when he was in the room with them, it was different. So he went back, and when they took a breath, he hit return. So with the transcription, what he found was when they breathed, they were speaking in verse, specifically in blank verse, and very often in iambic pentameter. So I refer to this a lot because we find this as well when we're working with our folks, that my fellow veterans and others now, that when we haven't integrated, to use your term, Bessel, or the science term, when we haven't integrated it, when it's still an experience, it comes out broken as verse. So Shakespeare is perfect in that regard because he provides a language that we may lack. He also provides the rhythm and the breath. We're very strict about the breath of breathing in, not because we're trying to make Shakespeare actors, but because the breath and the verse provides the container within which they can have the experience, survive it, come out and have a new experience, the mimesis, if you will. But Bess, would you talk more about that? About the, I mean, especially.
It's very interesting. It's really, as you're talking, I think, boy, that's another dimension that I have not studied actually, but it makes a lot of sense if you do language analysis. I think Jamie Pennebaker may have done it, and I've seen some other papers referring to it, that the language is disjointed and unrhythmical, and that's something that dovetails with another area that my colleagues and I are now focusing on, is the whole issue of sensory integration. And as long as something is traumatic, it doesn't get integrated in the brain and things don't talk to each other. And maybe the Shakespeare rhythmicity helps people. It's also interesting that when you look at it cross-culturally around the world, in response to a collective trauma, people always sing, people always recite poetry, people always have, the Greeks did it, and the Cambodians did it, and the Japanese did it. I've seen it in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. There's these rhythmical recitations of things that seem to really calm that whole central nervous system down. I think it could use a lot more work, actually, the whole specificity piece.
Yeah. And to your point,
Stephan, that article you're referring to, because you shared it with me. It's Trauma and Poetry on the World Trade Center disaster.
Great.
And a fair warning for everyone, he actually uses, with permission, a few folks' actual writings. So if you read the study, which it is available, you'll see that on there. But to that end, you were mentioning Jamie Pennebaker as well. I see this a lot, Bessel. I agree with you, and I think it's worth noting that there are a lot of writing groups, and we specifically do not, when they write, we keep it a very short amount of time, maximum of 10 minutes, because we found through trial and error that you go any longer and people get caught in that loop. They're re-experiencing, they're gone for the rest of the core that evening or that session. So we write for a very short amount of time, mainly so and they're never to be shared. They can if they want, but the intent is never, our primary intent is not for them to then read it. It's to conjure up in a specific experience that they've been dealing with, and then they get Shakespeare assigned to it. So the Shakespeare becomes the language for them, again with the verse. But we do not have them read it. In fact, we pulled away. We used to do it a bit, but we pulled away from it because we found that they get caught in, and it was from your book when you said that, replaying the old reel. It's like, oh yeah, we started seeing that when people would write it. You could tell people who'd been through, a lot of AA meetings or a lot of group therapy, because they had that thing. I mean, this thing was a routine by now. They're like, great, I get to write it out. It's a script, and may have been beneficial in some ways, but not for our purposes, not to conjure up the experience.
When we do workshops and we do free writing, we have people write, and then we say, what came up for you? Not what you write.
Yes.
And people say, I got stuck, or the stuff suddenly came out of nowhere, or I went to a very dark place, or suddenly I became horrendously depressed. And so the state that comes up by the writing, not the content of the writing.
Yes.
I want to mention one other great resource that's out there, and that is a film called Cracked Up. Bessel is in it. It's a Michelle Esrick film, and it's about Daryl Hammond. You'll recognize Daryl from Saturday Night Live, the longest cast member on Saturday Night Live, the man of a 10,000 impressions. Brilliant film. I can't wait for it to come out on DVD, because I want to take it in when COVID is over and show it to the prisoners, because I think it's such a courageous film, and it's documented so beautifully with film verite, Michelle just kind of following along behind and taking the impulses from Daryl. And they've been doing workshops, having different people come and talk, and I've been a part of that resource too. It's a great resource. Bessel, anything you would like to add about that film?
Well, I think the last discussion with Eve Ensler, who is now known as V, was just spectacular.
Yeah.
That is really very, very beautiful. And
Yeah.
you know, it is really astonishingly freeing to be able to tell your story.
Mm.
You know, and I could almost imagine that people may be jealous of Daryl, that he actually got to tell a story.
Yeah.
And all these poor prisoners have a story that's just as bad, and the story doesn't get told. The only story that gets told is how bad they are and how awful they are.
Yeah.
But the story underneath, and I think that theater in prisons has infinite possibilities in terms of having people tell their own story, doing Shakespeare. Now, it's interesting to have a discussion about what's the advantage of Shakespeare over telling your own story. I would think that maybe doing Shakespeare first to begin to become an actor, to begin to trust yourself as saying life, getting some discipline might be particularly useful. But this whole idea, for me, I haven't worked with prisoners, but to be not known sounds, that's just, it's so critical. We need to be known. Somebody needs to think about us, you know? And
it's why the circle becomes so important, because in that circle, there's trust and there's safety and the ability to reveal your darkest self.
yeah.
They watch it. I'm just facilitating. I'm just creating the space. But what happens is having others, it's that beautiful moment that happens in the film of where one of those young people starts telling their truth, and it just sucks everybody into it with empathy and compassion and non-judgment. And that's why it's so important oftentimes when people that are therapists or social workers come in to sit in on our circle, they'll ask me where I got my training as a group therapist. Well, you're doing group therapy. And I say, well, I hope I'm not doing group therapy the way you're defining it, but yes, it is therapy. We're therapeutic. We're helping each other. We're helping each other grow. I'm so looking forward to releasing this, and then we'll come back together again for a Q&A.
That'd be great.
And what I would encourage those of you that are watching this is to write down questions that you might have or impulses that you might have, so that when you come to the Q&A, that we can get as many of those questions answered as possible.
That's the fun part.
Yeah. Well, this has been really quite a remarkable, even more remarkable than I thought it would be. And I have high expectations, damn it.
Good. But this would be great to do Q&A together.
And another thing that we're going to do, this is also in the future, is we're getting ready to drop Stephan's film about his one-man show, and then we're going to come back together for a Q&A about that. One of the things is Stephan is one of my dearest friends and collaborators and companions and all of those things, my brother. But we often I talk about the fact that I'm not a trauma survivor. Not nowhere near. And I know what trauma is, because for 25 years I've heard what, the horrors of it, and that's just not me. And so sometimes I feel ill-equipped to do this work, because Stephan, which he shares, he is a survivor of childhood trauma, and then trauma in the military, and so I often feel less than, because Stephan is a survivor, and he's doing this work, and then he's helping others, right? And I'm just this the guys in prison call me, here comes this white do-gooder. Here comes the white do-gooder. And, but I know I have something to offer. It's just different. So in our conversation with Stephan, he fights the daily battles that people who are sufferers of trauma fight. It doesn't go away. It's ongoing and stuff. And that's, I think, has to be so important. And one of maybe the last thing, Bessel, is to talk about that that people who suffer trauma can begin to heal it and can find ways of, but that it's there. It's just a part of you. One of my guys said, I finally figured things out because I had come to prison for murder. And I kept trying to push my anger away and keep it away and tried to be as good as I could and get rid of all of the negative. And then what I realized is I'm negative and I'm positive, but I don't have to act on those impulses. And that's when he healed. And I'm happy to say, after 30 plus years in prison, he's home and he's hugely successful. But he says, I accept this about myself. So I'm interested in trying to gain, again, my own knowledge about this, because I don't want to guarantee that the guys are going to take this and do this and suddenly be miraculously healed. It's an ongoing daily battle sometimes.
Yeah, but people do get healed. That's just, so I saw Stephan do his play and I was blown away by it, as anybody would be. But I thought, did it help him to resolve his PTSD? So I went to see the play three more times, actually, before we actually got to talk to each other ever. And it's like, okay, how did it affect his life? And then I go, no, Stephan, we're very good friends. And I think it did take care of a lot of the PTSD, that people really can come to terms. And it's via the issue of self-compassion, which is so beautifully illustrated in Stephan's own work, that he really has compassion for that kid who went through that and for that soldier who went through this, and to really feel like, you asked me about self-forgiveness. A very big part of trauma is to go back to visit that person back then and to really know what that kid was starting with, knowing as little as he did. And that in retrospect, what he did may have been wrong or bad, but when you really get to see what this kid was up against, you say, you did what you could with what you knew at that point. And you were an unprotected, angry, miserable kid who nobody paid attention to. But now I am paying attention to you. I'm paying attention to that kid who still is inside of me. And, we see this in our MDMA study also very clearly, is that people can really come alive to themselves in a compassionate way. It's really possible. Healing is possible.
And I have to put in this plug too. He has an amazing partner, Dawn.
Yes.
That he gets to walk with, and that's the beautiful part of it, is to have a partner that can also assist in so many ways. And we'll talk about those things after you as our conferees have seen the film and then come back together. And we so look forward. Bessel, thank you so much for your time and your energy and your passion and what a gift you are. And I'm deeply grateful for you giving us this time. And
pleasure and a privilege.
And to my brother Stephan, who gave up some rehearsal time to come and be a part of this. That's a big deal for an actor to give up rehearsal time. So I appreciate that too. Love you both.
They're not exactly a wealthy lot, are they?